Hello and welcome to Conversations by Eclectic Spacewalk. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay, and today I'm joined by Michael Cholbi, professor of philosophy at Cal Poly Pomona, whose research is principally in ethics with particular emphasis on suicide, grief, and punishment. Welcome to Conversations, Michael.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. So let's jump right in. A lot to talk about. First and foremost, where were you born?
I was born in Portland, Oregon. My father ended up there after the Second World War. He was a World War II veteran and was stationed in Vancouver, Washington. And though he was from New York City, he found the city to his liking and stayed at a time when Portland was, really just kind of a sort of large, small town in the 1940s and 50s. And so I grew up there. I was born there and then grew up in some areas east of the city. First in a rural area, and then I suppose more in the suburbs. Mm-hmm. And I guess the sort of most interesting aspect of my background is that both of my parents had been married previously and had children in their previous marriages, 6 altogether. And I'm the only child of my parents, but I like to joke that I have 3 siblings altogether because I have 6 half-siblings, and if you should do the math, right, that's 3. So, in any case, I'm the youngest of I guess 7, and in some respects, I suppose, I was the only person to kind of go the more traditional, sort of college route.
Oh, I see.
So.
Okay, so Portland, Oregon, and then you said your dad is in World War II. We actually just recently watched Band of Brothers. And then got that whole resurgence of nostalgia, patriotism.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I watched with my own children Saving Private Ryan a couple of years back, which the idea that my father was at D-Day and was sort of involved in the kind of combat shown in that movie at the beginning still strikes me as. I always feel a sense of disbelief.
Absurdity, non-belief, all of the above.
We can talk about this later, of course, but one of the things that, one of the themes, I suppose, of my work is, the contingency of our existence. And it doesn't take a lot for me to imagine that a few different trajectories from some German machine guns, and I wouldn't exist.
Oh my gosh,
so, it's often quite striking to me how those contingent facts make a big difference to how your world goes, or whether even you get a world.
Oh, so true. And one of the things about Easy Company for Band of Brothers was that Dick Winters, the lieutenant that was in charge for the entire war, well, his commanding officer went down in the plane just coming over, and they trained for 2 years with them, and then they didn't even get to jump, and it's like, wow.
It's coincidence that he ever exist at all. So.
Yeah, right. That as well. Okay, so when you were young, so take us back into Oregon. You're growing up, and then obviously you have that interesting family dynamic. What was kind of your more early childhood influences? Was it thinkers, doers?
Well, it was funny. I was reflecting on this with my own children. I don't think that my younger self could have imagined probably me having the professional life that I've got now, because I just really didn't know about it, honestly. Right. I think when I was young, I probably had some of the ambitions that, elementary age boys do. I think I probably wanted to be an athlete. Okay. And later on, that kind of evolved a little bit. So when I got to high school, and then as I went off to college, I was thinking that probably the best opportunity I could make for myself would be to be a sports writer. Okay. To be a sports journalist. And I, sort of dabbled in that a little bit, which, in retrospect, I'm kind of glad I didn't. The journalism business has only become increasingly difficult.
That's where I got my start.
Sports journalism. 20 or so years. So I'm, in many respects, glad I didn't pursue that path. It did have certain benefits to me. I mean, when you had to, as I had to for a little while, produce capsule stories about high school or college sporting events, you had to write. Yeah. You had to produce, you had to be on deadline, which has proven to be, I think, valuable to me in my philosophy career. In that, I think I long ago lost my ability to make excuses for not writing.
Oh, sure.
Which I think people are good at making excuses for not writing.
Myself included.
I think I had that drilled out of me. So that was a benefit. But again, as I said, I came from a family that really didn't have, much of a background in higher education. Sure. So, the idea of going to college, I think, was a fairly revolutionary thing for someone like me, much less that you would sort of find your professional home at universities.
Sure.
So I think my younger self would be pretty surprised.
Right. And then, so were you reading just a lot of books, or were you like just involved in things? Like how did that?
Well, you know what? When I was really young, as I said, I grew up in a rural area, and so I think I had a childhood that is probably becoming rarer now.
Sure.
I was outside a lot. We climbed trees and played basketball and
got dirty, latchkey kids.
Waded into the river and got dirty and did those things that kids in rural areas, I suppose, probably still do.
Yeah.
But in terms of like reading, I mean, I was a reader, but I think one of the things to say probably that did have an influence on me was just that I really liked reading nonfiction. Not that I didn't like reading fiction, but I really liked reading histories and biographies and things like that. I remember reading a lot of biographies of like athletes and political leaders and stuff like that, which, I think that probably was good practice for becoming a philosopher.
Yeah, I was just about to say,
but more than that, kind of put me in the mindset of, I think I've always been interested in the fact that, we collectively have pasts and we as individuals have pasts. As we were kind of joking a while back, it's kind of a miracle that any one of us in particular happens to come to exist.
Sure.
And so I think that it gave me a very acute sense of, again, kind of the contingency of any of our existences and the way in which, events can unfold one way rather than another. And over time, the effects of particular events or particular choices, build and concatenate. And, those are the things that explain why we're here now.
Right. And then did you have it, so just to kind of touch in, and we'll touch more on his research and the broad topics of death and suicide later, but did you have any of those kind of things happen to you when you were a child, like any kind of things around, like even grandparents passing away and just kind of that around you?
I think in my case, being the youngest of 7, my parents were on the older side when I was born, and so I only really knew one of my grandparents. She died when I was in high school. So I didn't have a great deal of experience with death, but what I do think I got was, again, the sense that your own biography reaches well into the past, and that, your past can in a certain sense be, more or less accessible to you, right? I mean, not to say that my past was a mystery, but, it had a sort of more mythic feel to me because, both of my father's parents died in the middle of the 20th century.
Right.
My mother's father died in, I believe, the 1960s before I was born. So I think it gave me a sense that there are puzzles about sort of where we come from.
Sure. And how to figure that out is kind of...
Yeah, how to figure that out. And again, that sort of deep sense that, the past sort of bears down on you even when you don't realize it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's such a visceral part too if you have families that are close, like you said, in a rural area. So when my grandmother or my mom's side of the family is kind of from that in the rural area, and it's just kind of you're all the way around each other all the time, And then so if someone passes, then it's just a part of the thing as well.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So moving on, so you go to high school, and then did you start to say, hey, this higher education's a little bit more, or I want to continue this, or did you really get it in college and then wanted to continue?
Well, I think that what I noticed was just how comfortable I felt in educational environments and how normal it felt to be in educational environments. But I think, for the most part, I was a strong student, pretty much from the time I entered elementary school. So schools felt normal. They felt like comfortable places to be. I don't think I ever really decided in some sort of single decision or single fell swoop to be an academic. I think when I was an undergraduate, I just kept studying things, and people sort of gave me encouragement and said I was doing pretty well, and I just kind of did the next thing, whatever that next thing was, deciding on a major or going to graduate school or whatever it was. And I would say, strange as though it sounds, I kind of just ended up doing this. It wasn't there was a kind of moment where I kind of resolved to do it, right? It's sort of like, well, things are going fine, and maybe I could go to graduate school. Well, graduate school's going fine, and maybe I'll write a dissertation.
Yeah.
Dissertation seems okay, and people say maybe I can get a job in this field. So I won't want to say I stumbled into it, but there wasn't a kind of story where at some point I was sort of fully committed to an academic career. There wasn't an aha moment. It was more like, things are going okay, and I don't see better alternatives. So
let's just keep doing this.
Yeah.
So remind us. So you went to undergrad, then grad school, and then PhD. Where did you have to go geographically different? Did you move around?
Yeah. So I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, which I think is considered rightfully a really good model of the liberal arts college. It's kind of funny, actually. The number of prominent philosophers who went to Swarthmore is really pretty staggering. Elizabeth Anderson and David Lewis and a whole bunch of other people that probably people in philosophy know about. But it's a great place to go to become a future academic, because the size of the institution being small, you get a lot of feedback and a lot of attention on your own thinking, and you're given your autonomy, I think, is respected. And then, in terms of going to graduate school, I think, again, I wasn't necessarily someone who had my heart set exactly on, sort of a life in the academic world, but it seemed worth trying out.
Sure.
And so I ended up in Virginia, mostly I think because they seem to want me the most, which has been an important lesson to me.
It's always nice.
Well, I think it's important that you go someplace where, again, echoing my experience at Swarthmore, where people want you to be there, and they're giving you resources and attention. And UVA was pretty enthusiastic about having me. And I think also it was a place where, unlike some philosophy PhD programs, it didn't necessarily have its reputation tied to one particular area of philosophy. I had pretty broad interests. I thought I might work in history of philosophy. I thought I might work in maybe philosophy of science or something like that. So it actually didn't really, being an ethicist didn't really register, I think, very strongly with me when I went to graduate school.
So it was something, again, that just kind of worked out.
Yeah, and again, I think it was a good decision because, it was a place where you had strong faculty in a lot of different areas. So I think I needed to, explore the different areas of the field, learn more about them, see what was interesting to me, see what I was good at.
Sure.
And I dare say, I guess it turned out I was okay at the ethics stuff. So that's what happened.
Sure.
But I feel a little strange about my own academic biography, because in some ways it's opposite of what I tell students. You should have a plan, and you should think it through, and be very deliberate about things. And I don't think I was careless exactly about my academic career, but I also don't think I was sort of hyperactive.
No, but there's an opportunist kind of middle ground in there.
That's right, opportunistic mentality.
Just like whenever it comes, hey.
Yeah. So, but sometimes if you just make enough good choices in a row, you'll end up in a good place.
Yeah, that energy will then catch on. So then take us after you get your PhD, and then when do you start at Cal Poly Pomona?
Well, I actually had a previous tenure track job in New York City at Brooklyn College for 3 years.
Got it.
And I left there in 2003, and I came to Cal Poly in the fall of 2003.
Okay, so it's been quite a ride. 16 years?
16 years.
Yeah, wow. So. Okay. And then you mentioned that you're also, we'll just kind of update people to this semester, upcoming semester is going to be your last.
It will be, yeah. I'm going to be an immigrant. So I'm going to be accepting a position at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, effective in January.
Right.
Change in a lot of respects, different kind of institution, more research oriented. Obviously a lot older. I mean, Cal Poly is a
lot older.
1950s sort of era university. University of Edinburgh, founded 1583. Yeah. So a lot older.
And that's how we originally got the discourse started on Twitter, because you mentioned that, and I was like, man, to go to the University of Edinburgh, where I think David Hume and all the great,
it definitely was a center for Scottish Enlightenment philosophy.
Yeah.
I guess it's something of a compliment that I have a job that David Hume couldn't get.
Yay!
So since he applied to teach at Edinburgh, and they turned him down.
Yeah.
So, but it'll be an interesting adventure. Moving halfway across the world. And obviously, it's an interesting time to be moving to Scotland. Since
the Brexit stuff.
Brexit and kind of burgeoning independence movement there.
Sure.
So
what? I mean, broad swaths. What are you most looking forward to? Is it the research? You said that you have a little bit more inclination for that at this position. Well, just change of scenery. Like, is that kind of what you need, maybe? Or
I think the best way to say it is that I think it will allow me to do a lot of the things that I've been doing at Cal Poly, but with a higher level of visibility.
Got it.
Edinburgh sort of has a more international brand.
Absolutely.
than Cal Poly Pomona. I've had a great time being at Cal Poly. It's been a really fruitful and critical stage of my career. And I've accomplished a lot during the time I've been there. Very proud of what I've done there. So I'm not leaving there feeling any great sense of regret, but sort of looking maybe for a way to make the things I'm doing more visible, more impactful.
Sure.
Identify partners, that can leverage what I'm doing in a way that gives it more impact in the world.
All right. Well, you heard it here.
Yeah.
Go and do some collaboration with Michael at University of Edinburgh.
PhD students.
Of course. Yeah. You can write nice articles like me, but PhD students are what we need. So funny that you actually had a Reddit AMA, which is pretty cool. Just enough that. The fact that you even had that is pretty cool. But in one of those, I want to do a cool little not thought experiment, but exercise, if you will. So you got asked, how would you explain what philosophy is to a 5-year-old? And then you answered, quote, asking questions that human beings need to ask in order to grasp being human. And I thought that was a very interesting little tidbit for a 5-year-old to get. But what I want to know is kind of the interesting thing of the progression of knowledge, and that how would you change that answer for a tween or a high school graduate, or even for your grandmother, or even again for a philosophy undergrad, and then someone who's maybe writing their dissertation. Right. Again, you don't have to exactly answer each time, but how would you how would you go through?
I don't think the answer would fundamentally change.
No.
I think that the problems or the examples of problems that I might give to different people or to different age groups to motivate that answer or illustrate that answer might change. I think I share the view, which I think is pretty common among humanistically oriented philosophers, that I think almost everyone is a philosopher at some level. I think people engage philosophical questions all the time. They don't know that they're doing that, right? They sort of don't recognize them as philosophical questions. I think that the difference between, someone like myself, a so-called academic philosopher, and sort of everyone else is not the fact that we engage philosophical questions, because I think both groups do. I just engage them differently, right? With a sort of level of background and so forth that other people, don't have. And then, I'm supposed to kind of keep the conversation around the issues going by being a researcher too.
Right.
But I think when people reflect on their own lives, what are the philosophical questions that young children have? Well, I don't know, but I gather that they're going to be things that arise often from interactions with with other people and things in their environment. I've certainly talked to young children that are puzzled about, for example, how are we different from our pets, right? How is their experience of the world different from ours?
Sure.
When your dog barks, is that language exactly? Or what? Why are our communicative abilities different from an animal's? Or, you can get young children talking, I think, about very sort of basic questions in kind of quotidian social ethics. What makes a good friend?
Sure.
Or what makes a good parent or a good sibling. Then I think as time goes on, I think philosophy often is shows up in people's consciousness at sort of transition points in life. I think a lot of adolescents are attracted to philosophical questions because they feel a sense of change going on in their lives, changes in responsibilities and expectations, and changes in the kinds of relationships that they can have with other people. I think young adults have some of the same sorts of questions. I think in our society, the predominant model is that nowadays is that people will, try to leave the nest, get some education, get some training, try to pursue a career of some sort, achieve something like, economic independence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, one of the things that tends to happen to people in sort of early adulthood is they start asking themselves, after they've invested in all of that, why are they doing all of
exactly.
that? Like what is the purpose of it? I think as we age, other kinds of philosophical questions move to the forefront and other kinds of questions recede. So I don't think we ever leave the questions behind. I think they just tend to take different kinds of forms.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my experience, I've tried to be as public as I can be, with my own philosophical energies and efforts. And people are receptive to it, right? I mean, I think people are really thirsty in every society, but especially in ours, for philosophy.
Yeah.
They just don't know that they are, right? They don't know that there are these traditions and these texts and people like me necessarily that can help them approach some of these questions that trouble them. Again, I think everybody has a sort of philosophical temperament if you give them a chance to nurture it and notice it. And I think the role of academic philosophy is often just to sort of be the sort of most intricate or I guess sort of formalized version of the conversations that I think people have, at their kitchen tables or with themselves on the bus or with their therapists or with their friends at the bar.
And I think it's an interesting thing because you would, from my experience as being like a journalist and a locations manager and production, I just have gotten very lucky to be able to talk to a vast swath of society. Mm-hmm. So anywhere from janitors all the way up to C-level suites. But each person is just a normal human being going throughout his motions and figuring things out. And one of the things that I have at least connected with people sorely in conversations of rapport is not obviously water cooler talk, what's the weather like is cool, but really getting into the nitty gritty of like, hey, like, what are you trying to do in the morning? Why are you getting up in the morning? Like, what are you trying to do? And so those kind of things immediately become like almost like a green light for people to be like, okay, well, I can start thinking about this, or I can have premonitions or thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think that philosophy gives people, it honors, I think, their autonomy as people, and gives them a chance to empower themselves. I mean, I think that at its best, philosophy can be a really powerful source of human solidarity, right? Because I think that the things that we try to engage as philosophers or try to engage when we're being philosophical are things that mostly we share, right? Not everyone, right? And the problems take different forms. The problem of I don't know, a gay or lesbian person coming out is not the same quite as changing your political views or something like that. But it's in the same family. Questions about identity and your place in the world and so on. So I think what I hope that philosophy can give people is not necessarily or always good answers to their questions. Sometimes I think maybe the good answers are kind of elusive. Right. But what I think it can do is it can make them feel that the problems are not theirs alone, right? That we're working through kind of the muddle of human existence together, and that there is a long tradition, right, of people trying to figure these things out who, people who bother to put pen to paper. Right. The canonical philosophers. Most philosophy, again, I think is done by sort of non-academics, again, kind of as they're in the shower or as they're driving or whatever. And so it does end up on paper, which is kind of unfortunate, but, I think it can be a really powerful source, again, of alleviating our sense that we're alone in the world, or that our problems are unique to ourselves.
All right. Well, philosophize, talk to people, and keep philosophizing.
Yeah, that's right.
So, in that regard too, I think you hit on an interesting paradox with some things of like knowledge and just academia of trying to get out like information in general. And so, one of the things like language is so funny because it's like when you were talking about that people are doing it in their car, but they just maybe not know the moniker of like, hey, this is Kantian ethics, or this is labeling and stuff. And an academic maybe just can put that like paste-it note, that little p-touch, right there. Hey, this is this, kind of deal. And
yeah,
most
I
people
think
just don't know.
That's flattering to people. I mean, I've found that students, in my experience, when you tell them that a certain insight of theirs or a certain idea of theirs, has its has a background in or sort of resonates with views of Plato or whatever great philosopher it is, it's very flattering, right? Because I think it sort of suggests, I can discover things.
Just right? Like you said,
I'm not completely powerless or helpless in the face of whatever problem or challenge I might be facing. That's, of course, to point out that originality is in very short supply in philosophy. It's really hard to be original, but I also think it's a good thing to discover that you're not. Right? And even now, I don't know, 20 or more years into my own career, it's I think still very kind of thrilling, right? When you read another philosopher, contemporary or canonical, and you see them expressing thoughts or ideas that are similar to ones you've had yourself, right?
Oh, that was my rabbit hole and all.
There's this kind of a sense of there is something credible, right, intelligible, coherent about my own way of seeing things, and somebody else has been there
seeing
before.
It as well.
And again, I think just the sense of alleviating our feeling that we're kind of working our way through human existence on our own. That's one of the really powerful things I think philosophy can do for people. I think I've had the good fortune of seeing at my current institution at Cal Poly, students really forming communities, that are grounded, I think, in sharing a kind of philosophical temperament.
Right.
Wanting to talk to one another about ideas.
Right. And ideas, that's a great. Well, but some of these ideas, like you mentioned, are thousands of years old. Aristotelian philosophy of, hey, the only thing I know is I know nothing. I'm no one's teacher, really. But at the same time, you're Aristotle. Like what? But and then the second thing, exactly. But the second thing is we kind of want to hark on is. Philosophia is actually not wisdom in per se, but again the love of wisdom, and actually trying to the journey per se. Not exactly. Well, there's different interpretations of language, etc. But like not exactly ever attaining knowledge or wisdom or whatever, but always striving to do it. And that goes into the myth of Sisyphus, etc. But sorry.
There's always a question I think of. Why should I have a job? Which is broadly speaking, right? What is it that I purportedly know that I suppose the proverbial person on the street doesn't know? And it's not, I think, sort of the right answers to things. I think it's knowing traditions, knowing the ways in which different philosophical schools of thought, different philosophers have engaged with each other, what strengths and weaknesses they've seen in each other's points of view. So it's there's a phrase that I've heard people use that I think is very helpful, that philosophers are kind of like intellectual cartographers.
Oh, yes,
right?
yes.
Sort of you figure out what the lay of the land looks like. You don't necessarily know what the best place to be on the map is, but you know what's on the map, and you know how to get from one point to another. I think that's an apt analogy.
Right. But then if I were to take you and push you on that, is there ever a time that we'll get to the satellite then view? Because then it's like,
I think some of my views are right.
Of course. Well, they can be proved over time, and obviously more so than that. But like the cartographer, I like that because you're in it. You're trying to figure it out.
Right, and I think the other thing that I like also about the cartography analogy is that you can do a map at different levels of detail. Right, I can map the galaxy, or I can map the space outside this building. And I think philosophers, at their best, work above it, sort of above and below, right? They work both at very high levels of abstraction sometimes, but also work down at very close levels of detail. But I think what we get over philosophy is we get over time is a better sense of the strengths and weaknesses of different views.
Yes.
I also think there's, in some areas of philosophy, I can't speak to all of them, but at least in the areas that I know well, I think there is over time, some convergence on, again, what the strengths and weaknesses of different views are. I think some views become seen as more credible, some views become seen as less credible, which doesn't mean we exactly refute the less credible views, or we demonstrate, beyond any doubt, the more credible ones. But I think that, over time, we sift through them.
Right. It's more like we just kind of get attracted to the better ideas over time. I mean, not necessarily
I hope
better.
So.
Yeah,
I hope so.
Yeah, as well.
But I think we sift through them, and we sort of have a sense of which views sort of are more meritorious.
Mm-hmm.
Which, of course, I don't think philosophy is supplied with lots and lots of knockdown arguments that prove things beyond the pale.
Right.
But I think we do have a sense of better and worse views over time. I also think we over time map out more of the logical possibilities. Right. We figure out more of which views are available to us. So in ethics, there are people who begin with certain historical figures, say someone like Kant, but then they develop that thought and modify it, and perhaps delete certain things that maybe Kant himself held. Yeah. So I think that we get a greater diversity of views. We sort of see what the points of contact are among different views. I think we have a more crystalline sense of where our disagreements reside.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Michael, and then moving forward through some types of language with philosophy and talking with this is we got connected on Twitter, and it's really interesting to see that there's different platform or different groups that are using that platform: philosophy Twitter, SciComm, Econ Twitter. So what has that been to basically maybe democratize the message, if you will, of some of the expertise of philosophy that we were just talking about from academics to people who are just interested or laymen's,
Boy, it's a troubled subject, honestly. I don't think philosophy is done well on social media, which doesn't mean that there aren't maybe a few people who do it well, but I don't think it's a medium that's especially well suited to philosophic exchange, and so I actually tend not to do philosophy on Twitter. I publicize, what I'm doing, and in some cases maybe reach out to others about different kinds of collaborations, or just sort of share, items that I think are of interest. Mm-hmm. But I don't tend to actually try to philosophize on social media. I'm not an expert kind of on the sort of technical ecology of social media, I guess you could say. But it does feel to me as if, in the Republic, Plato is very skeptical about artists, and the ways in which they are at one remove from reality. He thinks that they just sort of reproduce things. And I don't share that view, but I think there's something he's right about, which is that I think philosophy is done best face-to-face.
Right.
And I think a lot of that is because as embodied creatures, I think when we interact together in the same space, not the same virtual space, the same space, I think we are more sympathetic to one another. And I think we have a better sense of discursive dynamics. We know sort of what to say, what not to say. I've rarely seen, during the time social media has been prominent in academia, what's that, maybe 10, 12 years now, I've rarely seen a sort of lot of kind of lightning bolt moments of philosophical insight on traditional social media. The blogs can be interesting. I find that to be a little bit ponderous for my own tastes, but I think that it's not a great medium, right? I think for understanding one another. It's got all of the features that I think tend to help us misunderstand.
Yes, absolutely.
And so when I think about teaching, students, teaching philosophy students, well, what am I trying to teach them, or what am I trying to engender in them?
Right.
Well, I'm trying to engender in them patience. I'm trying to engender in them a kind of guarded skepticism toward what they hear, but also a kind of charity toward what they hear. And so I think all of the kinds of intellectual virtues that I think we're trying to instill in students, not just in philosophy, but I think kind of in academic life in general, they're very hard to cultivate on Twitter or on social media.
No, and
it's the least hospitable environment that I can think of for those kinds of aptitudes and attitudes.
Yeah, I think it really harkens back to the medium as the message of Marshall McLuhan. It really depends on what you're trying to do. If you can make little, bits, of 280 characters, and you want to say something, okay, that's cool. Or you want to thread things together. That's what I've been kind of working on in my own stuff. But then, as you said, even going up to blogs or articles, and then going up to peer-reviewed, and then going up to books. I mean, there's a big progression of things, and that's only in print. We're not even talking about these mediums like talking, video.
Yeah, I would say, in the case of something like Twitter, and to a lesser extent, Facebook, it seems to me that a lot of the environment there is sort of intellectual one-liners.
Yes, I like that.
And that's fine, right? Like I have no problem with that.
It has a place.
Some of them are kind of entertaining, but I think they're kind of designed or intended to put an end, right, to a kind of conversation. And I don't see as much on social media that really is aimed at inviting a conversation and inviting a kind of careful, slow. I think that's the other thing to say, right? It's mediums that value speed, right? I don't think there are many conversations that are designed to invite slow, deliberate, self-skeptical reactions, right? I think one of the things that philosophy should train you to be is to be a little bit skeptical about your own patterns of thought.
Yeah, baloney detection kit, Carl Sagan.
Baloney detection kit. Yeah. So, as I said, I just don't think that they're particularly good for the kinds of intellectual virtues that philosophy at its best manifests. Now, as far as peer-reviewed research goes, I think the electronic revolution has been very good, right, in the sense that it sort of puts a lot of this information at people's disposal. That system is, as a system of labor and exchange, completely broken.
Yeah, I was on the other side of that for access.
Which it's increased access, but it involves huge amounts of uncompensated labor and a business model that, the critics, I agree essentially with the critics that it amounts to a kind of extraction of labor without compensation to people like me.
Yeah, and just as broad strokes is basically there's an issue of in scientific journals is that peer review. Basically, when you go through that process, you have an increased thing of legitimacy. Everything's great, but at the same time, a lot of that funding or whatever is coming through taxpayer dollars, possibly, et cetera, and then that access is not even open. So maybe not in philosophy, but just in the sense, the grand thing of academia and peer reviewed is just it's broken, like you said.
Well, right. I think one kind of blunt way to put it, right, to invoke a phrase from J.S. Mill, right, is that you can't really have a marketplace of ideas if you have some people trying to monopolize the marketplace, right, or trying to make money off of it, right? Which commercial publishers, that's their business model, and they're kind of sort of rent seeking on the production of peer reviewed research. Yeah. Again, I am very glad to do peer review because I learn a lot from it, and it's an important obligation in the field, and it's been very good for me. Without it, I suspect I would not have had as anywhere near as successful or as high profile a career as I've had. But the business model definitely leaves a lot to be desired. So.
Yeah, and I think we'll start that after our break, kind of getting into your peer-reviewed research, because 60 articles isn't bad there, But so let's.
I haven't read them all.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back a little bit. So you're leaving Cal Poly Pomona, but also you're leaving a couple other things that kind of, or one at least, is you're the director of the California Center of Ethics and Policy. So that has a distinctive mission for an academic ethics center to investigate ethics and policy issues by focusing on how those issues play out in our California communities and statewide. So first I want to obviously talk about that more, like what it is, but then also just the things of practical ethics. It's one thing to have an association of ethics, but then it's another thing to have it specifically in California working on specific things that are dealing with California. Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit more about that as well.
Sure. So if you look around the academic landscape, it seems like almost every university has an ethics center or a policy center or something that looks a little like that. And I think what inspired the center at Cal Poly, the California Center for Ethics and Policy, is the sense that most of these academic ethics or policy centers, their location doesn't really matter to their mission. They could basically be anywhere, right? The things that are done at an academic ethics center, maybe in, Belgium, are pretty similar to what are done at an academic ethics center in Sao Paulo or in Washington, D.C.
Sure.
And that's fine, right? Like, that's an okay model. I don't mean to take issue with it. But I think at an institution like Cal Poly, which, is a public institution in California, we wanted something that would, for one thing, mark us off as distinctive, but also echo our location and echo our mission. And California is an interesting place, right? So many of the challenges that I think nations throughout the world, not just the United States, face right now, they are problems or questions that are arising in California first, right? So, there's of course a national conversation going on around immigration, but of course, we in California have been engaging with the question of immigration essentially forever, right? It's sort of built into the state's DNA. Or things like natural resource constraints, water, real estate, those kinds of things. So the state, I think, has long been, for both reasons having to do with culture, but also just sort of reasons having to do with sort of matters of fact, I think a bit ahead, right, of the rest of the world in having to grapple with a lot of these questions. It's the first place to have, within the United States, to have a serious set of laws about environmental protection, one of the first states to give women the vote, one of the first states to institute proposition or referendum process. So
cannabis.
So many things, so many things where I think the state has been out front, in part because it had to be out front, right? It faced the issues first. And it's also a place where I think if you kind of forecast what the United States and different parts of the world are going to look like in a generation or two, it's going to look like California, right? Culturally and linguistically diverse, but with certain kinds of problems stemming from kinds of demographic patterns. It's a state where you have relatively affluent urban areas, less affluent rural areas that have their own sets of challenges. So what we've tried to do with our center is to think about ethics and policy questions that I think have significance outside of California, but to look at them within a California context.
Totally.
So last year, all of our programs were focused on the theme of healthcare justice and health access in California. And it's been a state that has been experimenting, I think, for some time with how to get healthcare or make healthcare available to as large a number of the population as possible. It's sort of been acting in quite explicit opposition to the federal government with respect to healthcare policy. This year, all of our programs at the center will focus on the theme of war and the military experience. California has been really very central in America's conduct of war.
Vandenberg, right outside.
Many bases, right? I mean, as somebody joked to me, what is San Diego without the Navy, but sort of a beach and some taco stands.
Really nice weather.
Right. So we have a very heavy level of military presence or military investment. During the First World War, we were serving as kind of a breadbasket for European armies, supplying wheat and other kinds of foodstuffs to the British Army, and then in the early 20th century, shipbuilding and aerospace took off here, and then in the post-war period, this was sort of a place where the peace movement had a very strong presence in the 1960s.
Oh wow, yes.
And we have in California the largest number of individuals who are either refugees or descendants of refugees from American military conflicts, so persons from Vietnam, Korea, that sort of thing. So it's a place where, though I suppose we don't tend to think of it this way normally, kind of war and the military experience is kind of all around us, right? It's shaped a lot of our community, shaped who's here, what's here.
Even all the space stuff, too.
That's right.
All the space stuff is based in military.
So who's here and what's here and what industries exist here. Down to Hollywood making propaganda films.
Zero Dark 30 and all that stuff.
So it's really it very much permeates our past and our present, and I think there's interesting questions about to what extent it's going to have a role in the future here.
Right. And then one of the things that you mentioned is kind of interesting to me is that's what kind of eclectic spacewalk I want to try and make it, because eclectic is a broad and diverse range of philosophies, right? And then the overview effect is looking down at Earth from like the ISS or the moon, So when you do that, you kind of hearken to that in the ethics centers in Belgium or Indonesia or Jakarta or wherever. Those places will probably have the most kind of standard, if you will, ethics, but then each individual place will have its own culture kind of lens or optics.
Issues are vary in how much gravity or relevance they have for different regions of the world. Yes. I think that's true. And I think California is just sort of interestingly situated both within the U.S. but also within the larger world. Again, it's a place that has been, I think, out in front of lots of cultural and political developments in the past. So in a large measure, what we're trying to do with the Ethics and Policy Center is to help students and help our community think more carefully about those issues, become more informed about them, perhaps contribute as policymakers or members of their communities in the future. I think Cal Poly Pomona is a place that understands that it is situated within a region, right? It's a regionally serving university, and that's something it should be very proud of. And we know that most all of the students who attend there will live the bulk of the rest of their lives in this region. Sure. They're not moving to the other side of the world for the most part, unlike me.
Yeah.
But so we're developing, I hope, right, current and future citizens and leaders who will help us arrive at the best answers to these kinds of problems.
Definitely.
But we're in year 2, so I think we've gotten off to a really strong start. But it's something that I think has a really bright future.
Okay, awesome. Well, we'll put any information in the show notes so people can look at that as well. So we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be right back in a couple more minutes. And welcome back to Eclectic Spacewalk Conversations. I'm here again with Michael Cholbi. So we talked before about your kind of personal journey, your research, kind of broad swaths of philosophy, but now we're going to get in deep. So we're going to start off first by kind of a little segue with, you are one of the founding members of the International Association for the Philosophy of Death and Dying. So it's a global organization of over 200 scholars interested in the investigation of philosophical questions surrounding death and dying, including but not limited to the metaphysics of death, the possibility and the desirability of immortality, death as harm or benefit, and death and life as meaning. A lot of other interesting topics, but maybe start talking to us about that and how you originally got into that. A founding member at that.
Yeah, well, so I've been writing and thinking about ethical questions related to self-killing, suicide, since the late 1990s. And when I came to Cal Poly in 2003, a few years into that, I was given the opportunity to teach a course that had been on the curriculum there for a while, entitled Confrontations with the Reaper. So it's a
interesting name.
A well-chosen name. And the course is a interdisciplinary course on death and dying. The emphasis falls on philosophy, but you tend also to read works in literature, sociology, history, things like that, medicine. But I began to teach that, and I just began to become interested in a lot of the issues that are in the philosophy of death and dying literature. And I also just was really taken with the depth and sophistication of the conversations you can have with students, in particular, when the subject is death. I really like teaching that course in large measure because I don't have to do a big sales job to persuade students that there's something at stake in our conversations.
Sure.
Sometimes in philosophy you do have to do that. You sort of have to sell students on the idea that some philosophical topic or line of inquiry should interest them. But in the case of philosophy of death and dying, I don't think you need to sell them on that. They know they're mortal. They have probably had a few ideas, a few thoughts, perhaps some of them a bit uncomfortable or unsettling about that fact. So you're dealing, as some students like to say, real stuff here. And so I think it's been very pleasurable to teach the material, but it's also been an important catalyst for my research. I mean, subsequent to that, I've written a little bit on immortality, desirability of immortality, edited some work on that, thought a bit about assisted dying, which originally when I was working on suicide, that hadn't really been a focus of mine. And then in the last about 5 years or so, I've been thinking very extensively about grief and bereavement, which, much to my surprise, is not a topic that philosophers have said very much about, and not enough, in my view. But around about 2014, I was at a conference in South Carolina on philosophy of death and dying, and everyone there seemed to think that it was a terrific event. And I said, well, we should do this again. And so the question then became, what kind of mechanism would be best for that? And that group, the group you mentioned, the International Association for the Philosophy of Death and Dying, was a byproduct of that. But subsequent to that, we've had 3 biennial conferences, 2 in the United States and 1 in Sweden, and then we'll be meeting next year in Melbourne, Australia. But I think I've also discovered that there is a very large contingent of philosophers thinking about these things. We've had 140, 150 different people present at our conferences, the last 3 conferences. Probably we'll see a whole bunch of new faces 2 years from now in Melbourne. So it's a very vibrant area of philosophical research right now. It's just a kind of a cool area because in some ways it's sort of cross-disciplinary, right? You think about questions in ethics, questions about well-being and value and things like that, but also, metaphysics, personal identity, various, aspects of social ethics. So I've often felt that philosophy of death and dying is a great way to introduce people to philosophy.
Absolutely. Honestly, it's a very, because it cuts across so many swaths of problems, situations, etc. And I mentioned, I think last time the first time I really dealt with death in a real way was I thought about my grandfather passing away, and we were all like fishing or something with my cousins, and then I just thought about him, just not being there, and then it was just like this world crashing kind of event with I'm crying and thinking
the uncanny discovery
of infinity and all the things. And so for me so my question to you is this the formation of this group, more events like this, is it just that people are getting more serious about it, or is it always been serious but then not given as much credence? Or
if you look at the history of philosophy, certainly in the sort of Western Mediterranean tradition, right? I mean, death has always been a subject on its agenda. I mean, you think about some of the most influential texts, right, in the Western tradition, works by Plato, the Phaedo, and things like that. I mean, they're about death and what happens to us after death, and what sort of attitude we should take toward it. And as I see it, going back to a theme that we were exploring in the first half of our discussion, philosophy can be a powerful source of understanding and solidarity. And if there's anything that, links us, it's our mortality, right? It's one of the very few things that is a genuine human universal. So I think we all have to struggle with it a little bit. And that makes it a really fecund area of not only philosophical research, but I think just sort of ordinary philosophical dialogue.
Oh, I mean, and then even in my lifetime, it's completely changed. I mean, for my lifetime, I'm 31, and when you're growing up, there was still this kind of hush-hush, taboo, whatever, and then
people
now
are starting to talk more about it.
Exactly. Or more celebrating life in general rather than continuing to focus on the death of it. When it's a thing, like you said, a human universal. We all have to go through it.
Well, I think we're seeing the slow diminishment, and I'm not offering people a thought as to whether or not they should think this is good or bad, but a slow diminishment, I think, of a certain kind of narrative around death that has been prevalent in the U.S. and other similar countries, the kind of Christian narrative where it's focused on dying as the preparation for the afterlife and so forth.
Right.
As you say, I think people's relationship to other people's deaths has become more focused on their biographies rather than sort of their post-mortem fates. And I suppose that's an indication that there's some decline of belief in the afterlife.
Right.
I don't have the numbers to back that up, but my suspicion is that there is some decline of belief in the afterlife. But again, it's been a subject that philosophers have had to wrestle with because I think human beings have had to wrestle with it. And even in the case where there's not much to be done, right? I still think it's important for us to arrive at what we think are reasonable attitudes toward it, right? So, one of the questions I teach, and people often teach in philosophy of death and dying courses, is whether immortality would be a good thing,
right? And
that question, I think, is an important question, even if, as a matter of fact, we never, develop technologies that will enable us to be immortal. Because when we ask that question, I think we are backhandedly really kind of asking the question, well, what should we think about things as they are?
Exactly.
Which is to say, how should we think about our mortality? Should we think that that's, as some people I suppose have thought, a great tragedy, a crisis, the worst feature of human existence? Or should we, on the other hand, perhaps think it's, some people have thought it's the best thing of human existence? That would be far worse for us to have, very, 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 very long lives. So I think, even when we're not dealing with questions that have kind of decisional importance, right? We're not sort of making a decision. We still crave, right, I think some grasp of what we should think or feel about the kind of constituent facts about who we are, right, the kinds of creatures that we are, which is not only mortal, but as a number of psychologists have pointed out, perhaps uniquely blessed or cursed in knowing that we're mortal.
Absolutely. Right.
You watch your pets, I sometimes do have that sense, you're lucky, right? You're going to die, but you don't know it.
Right. Right. That knowledge of it is that much more the bearer of responsibility, but then even...
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
We share our mortality with other creatures, but we don't share that with them.
Right.
And that's, depending again on what philosophical positions you're attracted to, that's either a boon or a bane.
Right, and so lots of things to go off on from that, but very quickly then, it's very interesting that you mentioned like animals as well, because that is a fundamental difference of not just the consciousness, but even how they deal with death. I was listening to a podcast that was talking about anthropomorphism and how in a lot of ways it is bad to make a bear, a teddy bear, etc. But then on the other way, on the opposite side, is that a lot of animals have a lot of human emotions that we think are uniquely human. For instance, they were talking about a dolphin who literally put a dead baby on her back for 21 days. Right. And then an elephant who literally they will go on walks off the beaten path to then basically rub their their trunks on the skull of someone that's in their family, and it's like that's crazy. But at the same time, very interesting and
grieving behaviors seem to be in evidence. I share, some of the reservations about too readily foisting upon these animal behaviors sort of human interpretations of what's going on exactly. But it is very striking that animals do engage in mourning behaviors. I think that underscores something that people in animal studies are increasingly grasping, which is that at least some animal communities have very complex communal relations, the kinds of relations that you need to have, right?
And death would be obviously a part.
The kinds of relations such that death would be the sort of thing to elicit this kind of mourning behavior from elephants and dolphins and chimpanzees and other creatures. So whether they're grieving, I'm not in a position to say, but I'm open to the possibility.
Okay. I like that. And then so moving on to that, from that is, different cultures have associated different values and had different markers over time, like really with dealing with death. Strikingly for me is like, say for instance, like the Vikings, how they would, basically do a funeral pyre or something. Also the ancient Romans putting the toll for the boatman. Asian cultures maybe doing more of a family-esque kind of generational back, kind of generations and generations. So how is our kind of culture, is it really dependent on the culture, how we see it, or has there been, some specific lines of thinking about death that have been apparent for, time immemorial?
Yeah, my business card says professor of philosophy, but invariably I think philosophy bleeds into other fields. And in the case of death and dying, it definitely bleeds into anthropology.
Yeah.
And I think the consensus among people who study death and dying from the standpoint of kind of the empirical social sciences, anthropology, psychology, and so on, is that American culture, U.S. culture, is maybe uniquely ill-suited to deal with death and dying in certain ways.
Yeah, sure.
At least culture as it is at present. In part because we're perhaps in a transition phase, right? The sort of traditional belief in the afterlife and sort of eternal salvation, damnation seems to be receding. That was really very standard, right, in the United States up until maybe the early to mid 20th century. At the same time that's receding, it's not clear what set of cultural norms and expectations and mores are coming into that vacuum, coming into its stead. And some of the things that tend to characterize U.S. culture make, I think, people's relationship to death and by extension grieving maybe a little bit more fraught. I'm far from the first to say, we're a somewhat more individualistic culture,
Absolutely,
more achievement-oriented. We work more than many other comparable cultures do. So for us, I think, mortality and death feel worse right? It's the end of you as competent, economically productive, autonomous adult.
The rugged individual.
The rugged individualism, right? Death is a pretty big insult to the rugged individualist, right? And so I think we in the United States are particularly challenged by mortality and death and dying. I think things are subtly and slowly changing. One of my colleagues at Cal Poly in the Department of Sociology, Jack Fong, has written a very interesting book about the phenomenon of death cafes, which are these kind of meeting places or sort of meetups, I guess you could say, where people come together to talk about questions or concerns they have about death and dying.
Oh wow!
And as a movement, it's really exploded. I know that there's hundreds of these death cafe groups or locations throughout the world, and quite a large number in the United States and several large ones here in California.
Right.
But I take that to be a sign that there is again a real thirst for thinking about this. I think the fact that we die differently and have a different kind of lifespan than people had, say, 50 to 100 years ago, also plays into this. We die slower than we did in the past. We die of more frequently now of chronic diseases. People know that death is coming by and large in our culture. Right. Whereas, when the predominant killers, as they were around 1900, are things like, infectious disease and sudden injury and so forth. You die quickly, and you can die almost at any time, right? I mean, it's pretty rare, right, for Americans in the early 21st century, to die in their 20s and their 30s, right? Whereas, that wasn't so unusual, a century or a century and a half ago. And I often blow my students' minds when I show them, mortality statistics about, now versus a century ago. I mean, the biggest killer for women, well into the early 20th century was childbirth and the after effects of childbirth.
But then, not to cut you off, or to interject, but isn't so interesting though now, depending on your cultural policies, which then are effectively made through politics, then you have what we have now is we have the worst child mortality rate in any of the developed country for in America, and it's like. How? What? Like you were just saying, we had this giant thing.
That's a whole different sort of tragedy.
No, totally.
But on the other end, right? I mean, we have what I think many people would say are not very good record of outcomes with respect to end of life care. We spend a great deal of money on end of life care compared to comparable countries, and I definitely think that medical institutions and policymakers and ordinary people are kind of wrestling with that question of how to die well now that dying is more prolonged, more predictable in some sense. I mean, in a way, right? Knowing as people would have, say, 4 or 5 generations ago, that death could come at any time, made people more ready. I know that sounds strange, but when it's a more kind of pervasive. Don't want to say random, but almost, cruel foe that can sort of show up at your doorstep anytime. I think that made people more ready, in part because they really couldn't procrastinate.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think people can procrastinate.
Death is at your door, as they say.
I think people nowadays, with people dying of diseases like cancer and dementia, that have long periods of decline associated with them, people can procrastinate, in terms of thinking about their mortality for, a very long time. I think almost till the very end, unfortunately.
Yeah.
No,
but you bring up a good point, going about kind of that rugged individualism, because I think that is maybe one of the big drivers of this kind of new techno optimism or techno utopia with with these people called transhumanists, right? Transhumanists. So my only thing with immortality is some cell biologists and people like that, like Aubrey de Grey comes out, and there's a documentary called The Immortalists. This is the only thing that I have. But basically the idea is that there's only 7 ways that a cell dies, and that basically it only dies because of just it's been alive, but just because it keeps dividing and dividing. So back to biology class. But at the end of that, apparently if we were to do good enough in science or technology to eliminate those, then we could theoretically theoretically have a much longer lifetime. So, what are your kind of thoughts on some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people, other philosophers sometimes classify me as John Fisher at UC Riverside says, as an immortality curmudgeon, someone who's not in favor of it. In reality, I think my position, it's a little hard to know how to describe it or pin it down. I mean, I think that mortality is so fundamental to human existence as we know it, and the ways in which we live, and the ways in which we relate to one another, and the ways in which we try to craft lives or biographies for ourselves, that I almost view the sort of the phrase immortal human as something of a non sequitur.
Yeah.
Right? The choice between the way we are now, which is to say mortal, and being immortal is not a choice, as I see it, between human mortality and human immortality. It's more like a decision to be a different sort of species.
Right.
And in some ways, I think that the questions that arise for us about the desirability of immortality, they can become confusing quickly, in part because I think sometimes we're asking the question, could creatures kind of like us have good immortal lives? Which I take to be an importantly different question from could you or I, shaped as we have been under the understanding of our being mortal and with relationships that assume mortality and so forth, could we have good immortal lives? I think I'm skeptical about the second question having a yes answer, but I don't take my answer to say much about the first question.
Right.
That, we could create creatures that come into the world knowing that they, will live forever. I'm not sure I would recognize them as my peers, because I think it's bound up with so many aspects of the human condition, the kinds of relationships we want to form, our motivations for forming those relationships, how we relate to time, how we relate to the past, how we, the ways in which we form our say, family organizations.
Are you saying that death gives life meaning? Is that what you're saying?
I would say that I'm not sure if it gives meaning.
Right.
I have some sympathy with that, but I would say it's a constitutive fact about us.
Right. Totally.
Right. It's not this sort of sort of contingent feature of our condition, like the clothes that we wear, the language that we happen to speak. I mean, again, it's a kind of universal feature, but also I think a feature that is very deeply stitched in, right, to all sorts of human practices, right? I mean, I'm not being particularly original here. The people who espouse what's now known as terror management theory, right, say that almost all of human culture can be viewed in some sense as an attempt to engage with the fact of our mortality.
Yes, I have heard this. Yes,
religion and art and these other sorts of things. I'm not sure. I think that thesis is true when stated so universally or so broadly, but I think there's something to it, right? That almost all of the kind of gross features of the human condition have something to do with our knowing, right, that our time is limited.
Right, and with that, I think, man, because that is such a fundamental thing but each person, you kind of get into this, again, theory of mind, the subjectivity of each individual's, existence, if you will. And then you're sitting here and you're like, well, for me personally, I had to kind of just get to that point, and then once you do, it is really a weight off your shoulders. In my mind, psychologically, and thinking about death. When I was younger, it was more of a thing. I didn't want to die. It was such this bad thing, etc. And then now it's way more of a kind of walking hand in hand. Obviously, you want to extend your life as much as possible. You want to extend meaningful life as much as possible. But at the same time, like you got to deal with that. You got to get over that real quickly. I
mean, I think our mortality, probably the best ways of dealing with it do nevertheless put us on a kind of attitudinal tightrope, right? As you say, most of us want to live a lot. Right. We want pretty long lives, maybe not as long as possible.
Oh yeah, it's a very
certainly
point.
We generally prefer more to less. We want to have good quality of life. Mm-hmm. I think at a certain point we realize, as the Epicureans pointed out to us, 2,000 odd years ago now, that fear of death and anxiety around death can be bad for life, right? It's a good way to make your life pretty miserable, is to be preoccupied, even unknowingly, with your own mortality. So we don't want to be, I think, gripped by the fear of death. But on the other hand, the antidote to that is not denial or ignorance, right? It's got to be living, acting, etc., in full knowledge, in full awareness of our mortality, but without, again, sort of letting those aspects of it that tend to make life more of a struggle take over.
That's totally right.
And so that, I think, is a real tightrope, right? How do we live mindful of our mortality but not gripped by it?
Yeah, and I think that goes into the future of work, though, in your social kind of theory, because it literally, that the whole question of like when AI and automation take away all the jobs, and then work has been such a fundamental thing to, like, especially the West, if you will,
right?
Throughout history, it's like, well, do we want to have, like, it's a different one or two questions. One is, do you want to live a longer life? But that is not the same question of, do you want to live a longer life when you were, say, 30, or when you were it's because what people think of is like extending life. They think of, well, when I'm 90 or something, then I'll get like some more years on the back end, and it's like, I don't know if I want that.
Right, the mathematics is complicated, right? So like one picture, that could happen with life extension is the one you're describing, right? Yeah. Where sort of what we think of now as old age, senescence, is extended for hundreds or thousands of years, which, I tend to think we actually underestimate how good a stage of life old age is.
Yeah.
But in any case, that's not, I think, what most people are hoping for. I think what most people are sort of hoping for is that kind of the big part in the middle lasts longer.
Yes.
Though I also think there's, something to be said for wanting your childhood to last a long time.
Absolutely. So, even longer now.
I've done this exercise with students a few times, when we've talked about life extension and immortality, sort of saying, suppose that you live 10,000 years, right? How would you want to divide it up, right? Give me, how many years of childhood would you want? How many years of like adolescence or early adult, how many years of like, what we think of as sort of early adulthood, middle age, and how much would you want, right? And of course, what most people tend to think of as immediately is kind of like they want the middle part to be really big, but I don't think it's patently obvious that would be the best.
Right. A little bit more spectrum.
Well, we know that old age, senescence, I think this surprises a lot of younger people, but the psychology studies tell us that it's often the happiest phase of life.
Yes.
And of course, many people look back on childhood as a warm, fuzzy phase of life. Not everyone, of course, but at least some people do. I often find it very strange that the part of life that most empirical studies tell us people find the least satisfying is the part that people want to last the longest.
Right. And it's like, well, but don't you think that that's kind of an interesting kind of enigma wrapped in a paradox? Because it's like those are your most transformative, if you will, years. Maybe so. Like people think, at least, or do you think it's really a psychological that they almost are predisposed to think that that's your happy time?
I've been doing some work on labor. I think part of it is that so much of the way we think of the human lifespan in countries like the United States is kind of oriented around that middle phase when people are working, right? So childhood is development for work, and then notice how we think of old age now as retirement, right?
From work,
which is sort of anchoring, retirement against the work phase, right? It's not a phase of interest on its own, right? It's sort of, defining something, right? It's after the thing you were doing, right? So, I think part of it is this picture of human beings and sort of what matters in life is productivity or something like that, which, I think that's wrong-headed in the end. Yeah. So I think that goes into maybe how we think about what we would want out of a long life.
Right. So moving on from death to not moving on, I guess you could say a cousin.
Can't move on.
Yeah, you can't move on from death. But a real big part of your research is suicide. Mm-hmm. And just to kind of give a broad brief thing is that's something that I kind of dealt with in high school and college and stuff is not particularly like emotional type of things, but things of like just not knowing everything. I think it's more of that like Nietzsche thing of just dealing with the existentialism and stuff like that everyone I think has to deal with and I think harkens to the death conversation. But suicide, that takes it a little bit more closer. And then if we were talking about death being taboo, suicide is even more taboo. So, just talk about kind of your research. Well, I think
one of the things I notice about my research is, I tend to be a fairly practically oriented philosopher, and I think that a lot of things I'm writing about or have written about are subjects where I think our cultures are kind of in transition or sort of at inflection points. As you said, there is, I think, a long-standing taboo around suicide in our culture and in many cultures. I think that there is, at the same time, right, that taboo sticks around a bit. There is, I think, a growing awareness of issues around mental illness and stress and anxiety and the things that tend to be associated with
work, like you were talking about.
Yeah. I think we're at a stage where we are increasingly ready, I think, to have a more sophisticated, and I guess I would say mature attitude toward the phenomenon of suicide. I think, I tend to think that most suicides are very unfortunate, but that doesn't necessarily entail that we should subject suicide to some kind of moral or religious taboo. That may be exactly the wrong way to look at it. So I think we're at a point where we're collectively sort of rethinking our attitudes surrounding suicidal thinking, surrounding suicidal ideation, probably for the better. I'm hoping that some of the stigma is lifted, but I actually think that one of the silver linings of that stigma being lifted is I think it's going to make suicide rarer, right? I mean, one of the things that I think is clear from the literature in psychiatry, psychology, and so on is that, talking about suicide, acknowledging that people have suicidal thinking sometimes, doesn't encourage it. Right.
No, it doesn't.
What it seems to do rather is to help people work it through. And most people's when they're attracted to suicide, they're not attracted to it in a way that's particularly durable. Right. It's often
it's more finality kind of.
A kind of fleeting thought. An impulse that doesn't last for days, weeks, years, etc.
I see.
It doesn't say, not to say there aren't recurrent suicide episodes in some people's lives, but it's a somewhat transient impulse. And I think that acknowledging suicidal thinking is actually a very powerful suicide prevention technique.
Right.
It doesn't seem to me that the taboo has done much good on that score.
And so, right. But don't you think though it's almost like a legitimacy is that like I kind of see it in other ways, is that the medically assisted kind of, because there's two types of suicide that you kind of have mentioned in your research. Is you have the medically assisted suicide, which is more currently called like euthanasia, if you will, broadly, and then run-of-the-mill suicide, where someone takes their own life by whichever means they see fit. So in that kind of way, it's the euthanasia part of the medically kind of assistedness, and then our dealing with grief or something has almost pushed us to deal with it because we don't want other people suffering, or it seems that most people don't want other people to suffer, even if it is you're about to die. Right,
and I think that the assisted dying movement, even though this was not necessarily one of its goals, I think one of the things that it has done is, to use the language you were using, I think it has legitimized suicidal thinking. And by legitimized, I don't mean necessarily endorsed, but brought out into the open, brought to the forefront that people, do think about this. Lots of people do. We know from all of the literature and psychology that lots of people have occasional, thoughts about suicide. But I think it's done a lot to domesticate, to make familiar the idea that people could have, things that look like reasons for wanting their lives to be shorter.
Good point.
They're not necessarily, mad or fanatical or, immature or cowardly or any of these other things that I think people have traditionally said about suicide. So I think that movement has done a lot to open up the discussion.
Right.
There are, of course, people who support the right to assisted dying for the terminally ill, but at the same time are very antagonistic toward run-of-the-mill suicide, as I've called it. But again, I think it's done assisted dying as a social movement has done a lot to open up a wider conversation. But there's that phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and I think that is true in the case of suicide. We know that sometimes just getting people to talk about it and acknowledge it tends to do a lot just to sort of help people through those times. And I think that there is again, the assisted dying movement has reminded us of something philosophically substantial that I think we all know, but we tend not to notice, which is that suicide has always been in our power.
Oh no, and I think that
which is
always
thought to people, right?
Well, I mean, that's how my kind of journey started. Was when I was in middle school, high school. I was more thinking those thoughts, but then I just kind of mentioned it to my parents, and we once, and they immediately like guidance counselor, et cetera. But Mrs. Robinson, the guidance counselor at my high school, was like you said, like was totally didn't think it was a weird thing. You know what I mean? Like, okay, this is totally normal, and then just asked me questions and just got me to talk about it, and then just from talking about it, it's like, oh, well, I just had a bunch of pent-up energy about this.
Yeah, I think therapeutically, or sort of from a public health point of view, the best strategies are those that take suicide seriously without panicking.
Very good point. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I think that there tends to be a kind of panicky reaction, particularly among, those who are close to adolescents and young people. Mm-hmm. And we know that lots of adolescents, have this thought, right? And only a very tiny fraction, thank goodness, act on it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But I think there's I believe you were mentioning it was Nietzsche a while back. I think there's a sort of important existentialist principle, right, that we're kind of rediscovering in our culture, which is mortality is a fact about us, but it's also one over which we have a little bit of power. And I think that's a very unsettling feature of suicide to a lot of people. I think that's part of what makes a lot of people anxious about talking about the ethics and politics of suicide, is that it reminds us that we have this power, and a lot of people will kind of prefer that not be so.
Right. Because then
there's no question about
that is true. Oh, I mean, and then again, to think about it, another dimension is just kind of like in euthanasia or assisted suicide, it seems like it's more medically with people around you, communal. I mean, obviously, maybe the final act is not, but like. Because what I'm thinking of is like in Japan, they have the suicide forest, which is like a very, somber, kind of very lonely. Each individual goes in there by themselves, and then you don't have anything, to tell and it just seems like there's very many ways to look at it, and very many ways how people deal with it.
Right. Well, we know, I think it's often worth keeping in mind, and I like to underscore this when I'm teaching this issue to students, is that we know that medical personnel have been involved in helping people die for a very long time. Right?
Oh, D-Day, like you said. I mean, your father.
Sure. Well, right. I mean, we know that many physicians in the military acknowledge doing this, but the anthropological evidence suggests that many cultures throughout the world have been helping people to die for quite a long time, and it's only been, I would say in the last maybe century or two, where you've had this very sort of strong, cultural proscription around suicide that extended to the medical profession. But I like to emphasize to students, that we, based on surveys of doctors and so on here in the United States, something like 1 in 50, 1 in 40 will admit, right, that they have helped a patient die, and that's probably an underestimate, right?
Right.
So our choices, as a society, are not right. No assisted dying, because that's not the status quo, versus legalized assisted dying. It's illegal assisted dying versus legalized assisted dying. And I think that tends to change the conversation and how people feel about it.
Oh, totally. And like you said, though, but in like all philosophy, almost it seems like the language is so key to just parse out.
Yeah, and just dealing in rudimentary fact, right? I think a potent question for me, or a potent question that has been very effective in engaging students around this issue, is just to say, if you had an aged relative, an ill-aged relative, would you prefer, if that person were trying to shorten their lives, would you prefer that it be legally available to them, or that they have to perform a criminal act to do it?
Right, and it's like when you put it that way.
I think people's sentiments, right, who are hostile to legalized assisted dying, moves the needle a little bit.
Right. And then so moving on from that, from suicide and death, it kind of gets into ethics, and you wrote a book your most recent book in 2016 called Understanding Kant's Ethics. And with this, like we were talking about Nietzsche saying, the death of God, etc., and it created a little bit of a problem for moral philosophy, because if religion wasn't the foundation that gave our moral beliefs their validity, what other foundation could it be? And if there's no God, and therefore no guarantee of cosmic justice, ensuring the good guys are rewarded and the bad guys are punished, then why should anyone bother trying to be good? And so it's like, kind of that utilitarianism versus, so talk briefly about kind of what Kant kind of was dealing with that. And I mean, he's the most famous, philosopher for his critique of moral reasoning in starting this whole.
Sure. Well, I mean, Kant was himself a theist, but his ethics are fairly unrelenting in being secular, right? The answer, I think, to the question, sort of what is morality's origin or its source for Kant is, well, you and me. At least the way I represent Kant's views, he's someone who believed that the fact that we are choosers, rational agents, that we can make choices, is the central moral fact about us. And because of that fact, right, we are required to treat ourselves and to treat other rational choosers in a certain sort of way. Nowadays, I and others tend to cash that out by saying that rational choosers are entitled to a certain measure of respect, which I think is a very powerful idea that's had a lot of influence on our culture. It's obviously had a role, backpedaling a little bit to the assisted dying discussion, the thought that a rational chooser has the right to decide the duration of his life or the circumstances of his death, if you will. He was no existentialist, right? But there is a sort of I think intellectual lineage that stretches from Kant to the existentialists, just in the sense that both of those schools of thought were quite convinced of the thesis that the source of ethics is us. Right. And the idea that there could ever have been a kind of source of ethics outside of human choice and agency, as Kant would put it, a heteronomous source of ethics, is just confused. So I think of Kant as, in many respects, the great spokesperson for this idea that each of us, simply by virtue not of our race, our gender, our intelligence, our social status, but just by virtue of the fact that we choose an act, are entitled to a certain kind of moral standing, right? A kind of respect. And I think that's a very beautiful idea. Right. And it's one that I've been trying to articulate and defend in different ways.
Well, and then from that, though, like the beautiful, it's so funny because it's really just seeing an optics or a lens of the utility of a certain thing rather than its appearance or anything like that. And then moving from that, like to grief. I mean, that's such a, you can see grief as like this terrible thing, and here I'm going to quote you on this from one of your things on 3x4 magazine. The Stranger, the Saint, and Grief's Goodness. It's a great quote. That we are drawn to aesthetic experiences involving emotional states that are otherwise painful or distressing cries out for explanation, and philosophers have proposed a number of solutions to this paradox. Yet there is another instance where we are drawn to emotionally painful experiences that has received far less philosophical attention and arguably poses even harder puzzles than the paradox of tragedy. The grief we typically feel upon the deaths of those we care about, depend on, or admire. So beautifully written, but like there's something to be said. Even in the worst cases, you have a nugget to do, and even in the best, you have to have that contrarian, like you said, mindset to not go full hog into optimism, etc.
Well, as I mentioned a while back, I think grief, it very much surprised me when I first started looking at this topic as a philosopher, because it's got a little bit of attention here and there in the history of philosophy, but it's not been, central, right, within the history of philosophy. You can look through the works of, many historically prominent, influential philosophers and see not a word written about grief.
Right.
But that very much surprised me, because here you have, again, a kind of, I would say, near universal of the human condition, something that causes people distress, anxiety, etc. Surely philosophers should, have something useful to say about this, something insightful to say about this. And, somewhat to my surprise, they hadn't said much very systematic, a little here, a little there. So the book that I'm working on, which I anticipate should be published between maybe 12 and 18 months from now, will be sort of the first attempt that I'm aware of by a philosopher to kind of have a systematic philosophical account of grief. And the central problem that the book addresses is the problem that you were referencing in that quotation. I mean, here you have an experience that is, I think even when grief goes well, fairly emotionally harrowing for people, distressing for people. And yet, I think most of us understand or appreciate that this is not a feature of the human existence that we should want to get rid of.
Yes.
Right? And that's weird.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
if I just sort
it's
of
a fundamental thing.
If I just described grief, right? You imagine sort of the alien species, landing on Earth, and they say, "Hey, we've heard about this grief thing. What is that?" Well, if I just describe it to them, I think their reaction is likely to be, and people think they should do that.
Yeah, you're getting less of that, right? You're trying to do
right. I mean, what so you've got this set of emotions and affective states that in ordinary life we don't think are good. We try to avoid them. We think that something has gone wrong if we're experiencing these things. And yet in the case of grief, I think not merely do we suppose that we sort of have to put up with it, right? Mm-hmm. I think we tend to suppose that there's something substantial or significant about it as a kind of life experience, such that we wouldn't think human lives were better, right, if the grief was extracted out of them. Right? We think there's something worse.
Yes.
Right? The question is, well, what is that? Right? What is it that grief provides us, or why should we think it's a worthwhile, or can be a worthwhile experience, despite sort of on its surface looking quite terrible. I was recently writing about the grief of C.S. Lewis, right?
Oh yes,
the Christian writer known for the Chronicles of Narnia books to most, but he wrote this memoir, Grief Observed. Which was not published during his lifetime under his own name. It was only published under a pseudonym, interestingly. But, you read this book by, man of reason, like C.S. Lewis, right? Dapper, Oxford, and you read this memoir where, I think he's being relatively unguarded. This guy is seriously troubled, almost like, I think some people would say, cracking up, over his wife's death. And, you read this and still your reaction is, I don't think this experience is one that I would wish on people generally speaking, but it's important for him to have it. And so for me, the philosophical question or problem that I'm trying to address, I think throughout much of my work on grief is, well, how come?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What's the purpose or point, or what's the good of it? Another sort of illustration of this is from Camus, right? In the novel The Stranger.
Yes.
Meursault is this sort of character who can't grieve. And I think most of us, our reaction to Meursault, maybe we kind of admire when we're in our kind of, leather jacket existentialist mode. Here's this kind of independent figure who, is sort of floats above it all. Mm-hmm. But I think when we really look at him, we pity him.
Yeah.
Right? Because he can't grieve because he doesn't have the kinds of connections to other people that are preconditions of grieving them.
Yeah.
And that seems not to be a welcome feature of Meursault's life, but a great detriment.
Yeah, and then when you said, and you kind of brought in St. Augustine too, and that the stranger, the saint, and the grief's good. And so we'll kind of end with this quotation that you ended it on, which is another splendid thing: is when others die, we are brought face to face with the chilling reality that, as Ernest Becker put it, each of us, quote, is a small trembling animal who will someday decay and die. But so long as we survive, the grief that others' deaths produce need not be seen as an unmitigated bad. Despite being haunted by his grief, Augustine and us and everyone else is at least able to be invested in another such that another's death can be counted as a loss to him. Yeah. Like him, we ought to take grief as an opportunity afforded to socially interdependent, practically committed beings like ourselves. So. Yeah. Beautiful that, again, someone's death is almost a lost potentiality of me, or what my life and experience could be, because they have not continued as such.
Yeah, and I think, we build lives for ourselves where certain things are, sort of taken for granted, right? And one of them is people, right? And, we build our sort of expectations about what our lives will look like and how they'll unfold around those other people. We know, right, that their existences are contingent, just as we know that our existences are contingent. But I think that a lot of what people experience in grief is, of course, sadness at the loss of this particular person, but they also, I think, feel a deep sense of disorientation.
Yes.
Right? That, as I put it a couple of times in things I've written, I think grief feels as much like a loss of self as a loss to self, right? It sort of feels like the world has been in some way upended for you.
Yeah, your point.
And I think that says something about the kinds of creatures you we have to be, or the kinds of creatures that we are, such that, we can grieve, right? We don't just have relationships with others where, they're purely transactional, right? Where we get X from them and they get Y from us. I think we invest in them, right? Yeah. And we become emotionally and psychologically invested in them. And we, again, sort of build our self-conception or self-understanding around them. And when they die, that self-conception has to change somehow, right? It can't continue just as it did before.
No, that's totally right.
And I think the challenge of grief is to figure out, to put it in a kind of cliche way, but in a way that's nevertheless insightful, I think the challenge is to figure out how to go on.
Yeah, and my personal anecdote with that is I actually was very fortunate of who it was and the family and how it all happened. But I actually lost one of my good friends, Jay Carousel, sophomore year of college. He came up from Hurricane Katrina, was a part of our friends group, and he passed away in a car accident. But at his funeral in New Orleans, his dad took us into a room, us 8 individuals, I guess you could say, guys, and he played us Don Henley's In a New York Minute. And he was just like, look, you guys love Jay, Jay, and so that grief was not, and it changed my aspect of death, and from literally that point on, it was a celebration of life. Mm-hmm. It was not a sitting there being, mad or sad that you're never going to experience that thing with that person again. But that's the importance of you having to do it now, then, in the present, and like you said, keep going on.
Yeah, I mean, the Becker quote that I referenced from what you read a moment ago, I mean, sure, we all are these small trembling animals. But here's the thing, I am that small trembling animal. And
we are here.
Well, but, and I'm the only small trembling animal I'm ever going to be or have.
Yes.
And so, my choice is not, I think, to deny that I am the small trembling animal, but also not to try to act as if I'm something that I'm not.
No.
But to be the best, happiest, most virtuous, small trembling animal that you can be, because I don't think that we have any other choice in the matter.
No, we don't. So, I don't think so. And honestly, that's been kind of my personal journey too. Well, okay. This is the last question.
Sure.
So if you're that trembling, insightful, but endearing animal. And say you're, again, Eclectic Spacewalk, so think about kind of you're at the International Space Station or at the moon, and you're seeing the Earth and everyone's looking up at you. What do you say? Or what do you do? Because I've gotten many, it's an interesting response about what people would do when the eyes of the world are on you. What would you have to say to them? Because you are a trembling animal, but at the same time, you are a trembling animal,
Well, I think, again, be the best small trembling animal you can be and make the most of that. But I think, sort of the underlying message of a lot of my work is sort of it's a strange combination, sort of that we're both, I think, deeply noble beings, but at the same time deeply vulnerable beings.
Very good.
And much of the challenge of human life, which I hope philosophy can help us, grapple with and figure out, is to how to be both of those things, right? And not sort of embrace one at the expense of the other, and that. Those who are down on earth ashamed or worried about the vulnerable part don't have to feel worry or shame. Those who are anxious about the noble part, they don't need to feel worry or shame either. Those are sort of the coexistent features of the strange human creatures that we are, and we live best when we live with both of those things.
Yeah,
live fully
we're walking that tightrope, as you said. Yeah,
both of them together.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, being noble and being vulnerable with Michael Cholbi.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. Yeah, we'll put all the show notes and links and stuff where you can find Michael's work, and then send him best wishes for when he goes off the pond across the Atlantic. So thanks for joining us on the conversation.
No problem.